She was starving, forgotten, invisible, until the moment the king's procession stopped before her in the village square. "Come with me to the castle. I will give you 100 gold coins," he announced, shocking the entire kingdom. But why would a powerful monarch single out a filthy beggar girl from hundreds of desperate souls? As Alara is thrust into the treacherous world of royal politics, she discovers a dying princess, whispered threats in shadowy corridors, and a sinister plot that threatens the very heart of the kingdom. The promised gold coins fade into insignificance as she realizes the terrible truth. She wasn't chosen by accident. What happens when the most powerless person in the kingdom becomes the only one who can save it? And what price will she pay for standing between a princess and those who want her silenced forever? The frigid morning air sliced through Alara's tattered clothes like invisible knives, each breath burning her lungs as she huddled against the village's stone fountain. Blood crusted under her fingernails, not her own, but from the rat she'd caught and devoured raw the previous night. Her stomach still cramped, punishment for the first meal she'd had in 3 days. A trumpet blast shattered the market square's quiet, causing her heart to seize painfully in her chest. The king's procession. Alara pressed herself further into the shadow of the fountain, hoping to become invisible. Being noticed by nobility never ended well for people like her. The thundering hoofbeats approached, each one matching the frantic rhythm of her pulse, dust and fog swirling in their wake. Then, impossibly, the procession halted. The crowd parted like water around a stone, and Alara found herself exposed, trembling under the direct gaze of King Aldrich himself. His steel-gray eyes dissected her, seeing through layers of filth to something underneath that made his expression shift. Not disgust. Something worse. Interest. "You." The king's voice rang across the suddenly silent square, pointing a gloved finger directly at her. "Come with me to the castle. I will give you 100 gold coins." The square erupted in gasps and muttered curses. Alara's throat constricted, stealing her ability to speak or even breathe. 100 gold coins was more than most villagers saw in a lifetime. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. A cruel jest, a death sentence dressed as charity. The nobles flanking the king exchanged smirks, their laughter like poisoned honey in her ears. "Your Majesty," she finally managed, her voice a cracked whisper, "why would you choose me?" The question hung in the frigid air between them. The king's face remained impassive. "Do you refuse your king's generosity?" Refuse? How could she refuse? Yet everything inside her screamed to run. Her legs began trembling so violently she feared they would buckle beneath her. Each heartbeat pulsed against her temples like a blacksmith's hammer. The unwashed mass of her hair clung to her sweating neck despite the cold. Every instinct honed from years on the streets warned her of danger. But the crowd watched, hundreds of eyes boring into her. If she refused, they would tear her apart for insulting the king. If she accepted, what fate awaited her behind those towering castle walls? "I am honored, Your Majesty," she managed, forcing the words through numb lips. As the king's guard roughly hoisted her onto a spare horse, Alara caught glimpses of the villagers' faces. Some wore expressions of undisguised hatred. Why her and not them? Others showed pity, as though watching a condemned prisoner's final march. The horse's saddle chafed against her thighs, unused to such a seat, and the animal's scent mingled with her own stench of poverty and fear. With each hoofbeat carrying her toward the castle, Ilara's thoughts fractured like ice under too much weight. Her mother's last words before the plague took her echoed unbidden. "Trust nothing that comes without a price." What price would these 100 gold coins demand? Her labor, her dignity, her life? The town receded behind them, giving way to rolling countryside that in another lifetime might have seemed beautiful. Now it felt like crossing a boundary between worlds, leaving behind the one place where she understood the rules of survival. The rhythmic clop of hooves became a funeral dirge counting down her remaining moments of freedom. "Why do you tremble so?" asked a young knight riding beside her, his voice surprisingly gentle. The king's favor should bring joy, not terror. Alara couldn't answer. How could she explain that kindness from the powerful was often more dangerous than their cruelty? That unexpected mercy usually concealed the sharpest blades. Instead, she fixed her gaze on the castle looming ever larger on the horizon, its stone towers seeming to pierce the very sky. As they approached, Ilara's breath caught. She'd glimpsed the castle from afar all her life, but never imagined standing in its shadow. Its walls stretched impossibly high, gray stone threaded with veins of something that sparkled like silver in the weak sunlight. Guards lined the ramparts, their armor gleaming, their eyes following her with suspicion as the gates creaked open to admit the procession. The courtyard swallowed them in shadow and noise, servants scurrying, blacksmiths hammering, horses nickering. Ilara was half pulled, half lifted from her mount, her legs nearly collapsing as they touched solid ground. The smell overwhelmed her. Horse manure, yes, but also bread baking, meat roasting, perfumes and oils, and 100 other scents her street-trained nose couldn't identify. Hands guided her through arched doorways into the castle proper. The temperature changed instantly, warmer, but somehow more suffocating. Tapestries lined walls that seemed to stretch endlessly upward, depicting battles and hunts where men with cruel faces drove spears into dying creatures. Ilara's heart mirrored the terror in those woven animals' eyes. Whispers followed her passage. Filthy creature. What could His Majesty be thinking? She'll steal everything not nailed down. Each word a lash against her already raw nerves. Courtiers gathered in clusters, their silks rustling like insect wings as they turned to stare at the interloper in their midst. The great hall's massive doors swung open before her, revealing a chamber larger than the entire village square. Hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows across faces both curious and hostile. The ceiling arched so high above that it disappeared into darkness, while beneath her bare, cracked feet spread a floor of polished marble that reflected her dirty, distorted image back at her. King Aldrich took his seat upon the throne, the carved wooden wolves at its arms seeming to snarl at Ilara as she was pushed forward. Her knees shook violently, threatening to deposit her in a shameful heap before the assembled court. "Your Majesty," whispered an advisor at the king's ear, loud enough for Ilara to hear. "The coins as you promised?" The king raised his hand for silence. The entire hall held its breath as he leaned forward, studying Ilara with those penetrating eyes that seemed to strip away skin and flesh to examine what lay beneath. "I did promise 100 gold coins," the king said, his voice echoing through the vast chamber, "and a king's word is law." Relief flooded through Ilara so powerfully she nearly wept. She would take the coins and flee, find some distant village where no one knew her face, perhaps even buy a small plot of land. "But first," the king continued, shattering her brief moment of hope, "this woman will serve as companion to my daughter." The hall erupted in shocked murmurs. A lady near the front actually swooned, caught by her horrified companions. Ilara's vision narrowed to a pinpoint, blood roaring in her ears. Companion to the princess? It was madness. It was impossible. "Your Majesty," she croaked, desperation overcoming fear, "I know nothing of court life. I cannot—" "You question your king's command." The words fell like stones into a still pond, ripples of tension spreading through the assembled nobles. Ilara's mouth snapped shut. The promised gold had vanished like morning mist, replaced by something far heavier, a royal burden she could neither carry nor refuse. As guards moved to escort her deeper into the castle's labyrinth, away from the only life she'd ever known, one terrible thought crystallized in her mind. This was no random act of charity. The king had sought her specifically, had singled her out from all the beggars in the kingdom, and she had no idea why. The servants' hands felt like spiders crawling across her skin as they pushed Ilara through the castle's winding corridors. Each turn disoriented her further, stealing any hope of finding an escape route. The stone walls seemed to close in, the flickering torchlight casting grotesque, elongated shadows that mocked her every step. A tall woman with iron-gray hair and fingers like talons led the procession, her back ramrod straight, her disgust evident in the tight pinch of her nostrils. "You will not speak unless spoken to," the woman instructed, her voice cold as a winter stream. "You will not touch anything without permission. You will not look directly at nobility. You are here by His Majesty's inexplicable mercy, not by right." Alara's throat constricted around unspoken questions. What mercy demanded she be torn from the familiar squalor of her existence and thrust into this gilded prison? The promised 100 gold coins seemed a distant dream now, evaporating like morning dew beneath the harsh sun of reality. They arrived at an ornate door carved with intertwining vines and blooming flowers that seemed to move in the wavering light. The gray-haired woman produced a heavy iron key and unlocked it, revealing chambers so vast that Alara's first instinct was to retreat back into the hallway. The ceiling arched impossibly high, painted with clouds and birds in mid-flight. Massive windows overlooked the castle gardens, their panes of glass worth more than everything Alara had ever touched in her life combined. "These will be your quarters," the woman said, the statement landing like a slap, adjacent to the princess's chambers. A younger servant girl with frightened rabbit eyes dragged forward a copper tub, while others poured steaming water into it from heavy pitchers. The pungent scent of lavender and rosemary oils stung Alara's nostrils, so different from the familiar stench of her own unwashed body. "Remove those filthy rags," the older woman commanded, turning her face away as though the sight physically pained her. Alara's hands flew protectively to her chest, clutching the tattered remains of her only dress. "Here, now, before all of you?" A ripple of cruel laughter spread through the gathering of servants. The older woman's eyes narrowed to flint-like slits. "Modesty? From a street rat? How precious." She gestured sharply, and 2 servants moved forward with the clear intention of forcibly stripping her. "Wait!" Alara raised her hands in surrender. "I'll do it myself." With trembling fingers, she unfastened the frayed rope that served as a belt. The dress, once blue, now an indeterminate gray-brown, slipped from her shoulders, exposing skin mapped with scars and ribs that pressed against her flesh like accusatory fingers. The servants' eyes raked over her, some with disgust, others with a clinical detachment that somehow cut deeper. The water scalded her skin as she stepped into the bath, her body unused to such heat. Years of grime began to dissolve, turning the water a murky brown within moments. A servant scrubbed her back with a rough cloth, each stroke like sandpaper against her tender skin. Another attacked her matted hair with sharp, painful tugs, muttering curses under her breath. "Filthy beyond salvation," one whispered to another, just loud enough for Alara to hear. "The princess will catch her death just breathing the same air," came the reply. Alara closed her eyes, trying to shut out their voices, but they continued to buzz around her like stinging insects. When finally deemed clean enough, she was yanked from the water and wrapped in linen so fine it felt like a cloud against her raw skin. Her hair, now revealed to be a rich copper color beneath the years of dirt, was combed and pinned into a simple style that pulled painfully at her scalp. A silk dress the color of spring leaves was thrust into her arms, its weight foreign and uncomfortable. She struggled into it, fumbling with fastenings she'd never encountered before. The fabric whispered against her clean skin, a constant reminder of her displacement. "Turn around," the gray-haired woman ordered, inspecting Alara with the same scrutiny one might give a questionable cut of meat. "Well, you look marginally human now, though nothing can be done about those hands." She pointed disdainfully at Alara's calloused palms and broken nails. "Or those scars." A servant approached with a small wooden box, which, when opened, revealed an assortment of glittering items that made Alara take an instinctive step back. The woman removed a delicate silver chain with a small emerald pendant. "His Majesty insists you look the part," she said, fastening the necklace around Alara's throat. It felt like a noose, the cool metal a stark contrast to the heat of shame flushing her neck and cheeks. "I don't understand," Alara whispered, her voice small in the cavernous room. "Why am I here? What does the king want with me?" The woman's face remained impassive. "It is not your place to question the king's will." She gestured toward a small table laden with fruits, bread, and cheese. "Eat. The princess will receive you in an hour." Left alone, Alara approached the food with caution born of years of scarcity. Her stomach growled painfully, but suspicion held her back. Was this too part of some elaborate trap? She picked up a grape, rolling it between her fingers, its skin taut and perfect. No rot, no mold, a luxury she'd scavenged for but rarely found. She bit into it, the burst of sweetness so intense her eyes watered. Once she began, she couldn't stop. She tore into the bread, stuffed cheese into her mouth, devoured apples and pears with animal ferocity. Only when the plate was nearly empty did she become aware of her behavior, of the crumbs on her new dress, of the shame that burned hotter than any fever. A soft knock at the door froze her mid-bite. A young servant girl, different from the others, with kind eyes and a hesitant smile, entered with a small cup of steaming liquid. "For your nerves, miss," she offered. "Meeting the princess can be overwhelming." Elara accepted the cup, inhaling the unfamiliar spicy sweet scent. "What is she like, the princess?" The girl glanced nervously over her shoulder before replying. "Princess Lyra is unwell. Has been for months now. That's why." She stopped herself, eyes widening as though she'd said too much. "That's why what?" Elara pressed. "Nothing, miss. It's time now, please follow me." The princess's chambers made Elara's quarters seem austere by comparison. Gold leaf adorned the ceiling in intricate patterns. Tapestries depicting hunting scenes and mythical creatures covered walls draped in silk. The air hung heavy with incense and something else, the unmistakable smell of sickness, which no amount of perfume could disguise. Princess Lyra reclined on a massive bed, surrounded by pillows that seemed to swallow her slight frame. Her skin was so pale it appeared translucent, blue veins visible beneath like rivers on a map. Her eyes, large, dark, and unnervingly alert, fixed on Elara immediately. "So you're the one my father has chosen," the princess said, her voice surprisingly strong despite her frail appearance. There was no disgust in her tone, no mockery, only a strange, detached curiosity. Elara dropped into an awkward curtsy, recalling too late the instructions not to look directly at nobility. "Your Highness, I—" "Come closer," Lyra interrupted, patting the edge of her bed. "Let me look at you properly." Every instinct screamed at Elara to flee. She felt dozens of eyes on her back. Ladies-in-waiting, physicians, servants, all watching for her to make a mistake. With wooden steps, she approached the bed, stopping just short of touching it. The princess studied her with an intensity that made Elara's skin prickle. "They've dressed you like a doll," she observed. "Do you like it?" The question caught Elara off guard. No one had ever asked what she liked before. "It's very fine, Your Highness. Too fine for someone like me." "Someone like you?" Lyra repeated, a hint of amusement in her tired eyes. "And what sort of someone are you exactly?" Before Elara could answer, a commotion at the door drew their attention. King Aldrich entered, his presence immediately filling the room. Everyone bowed deeply, including Elara, who nearly lost her balance in the unfamiliar dress. "Daughter," the king acknowledged Lyra with a nod. His eyes then settled on Elara, assessing the transformation. "Does your new companion please you?" Something flashed across the princess's face, a brief rebellion quickly suppressed. "She's different from the others, father." "Others?" Elara's heart raced. How many had come before her? "Good," the king replied, his voice betraying nothing. "Perhaps she will succeed where they failed." He departed as abruptly as he'd arrived, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. The room gradually emptied of courtiers and servants, until only Elara and the princess remained, with 2 silent guards posted at the door. "Don't look so terrified," Lyra said once they were alone. "I don't bite. I barely have the strength to lift my own cup these days." Elara's mouth felt dry as sand. "Your Highness, I don't understand my purpose here. I'm no healer, no noble companion. I'm nothing." "Nothing," Lyra echoed, the word hanging in the air between them. "How interesting. I sometimes feel like nothing too, despite being draped in everything." She gestured weakly at her opulent surroundings. "Perhaps that's why my father chose you." A tear slipped unexpectedly down Elara's cheek, not from fear or sorrow, but from the strange recognition in the princess's voice. In this gilded cage, surrounded by luxury beyond imagination, she recognized the hollow emptiness that had been Elara's constant companion on the streets. "Will you tell me about it?" Lyra asked suddenly. "About being nothing?" About living beyond these walls? The request felt like stepping onto thin ice. One wrong word could send her plunging into depths from which she might never surface. But the princess waited, her eyes hungry for something beyond the sickness and luxury that imprisoned her. And in that moment, Alara realized the true price of the 100 gold coins she'd been promised, a price far higher than she could have imagined. For what the king demanded of her wasn't service or skills or beauty, it was truth. Morning light spilled through leaded glass windows, casting rainbow fragments across Alara's face as she was escorted back to Princess Lyra's chambers. She'd barely slept, the bed too soft, her mind too crowded with questions that multiplied like rats in the dark corners of her thoughts. The silk dress from yesterday had been replaced with another, this one the color of autumn leaves, embroidered with tiny golden birds that caught the light when she moved. The fabric whispered against her skin, still raw from yesterday's scrubbing, a constant reminder of her precarious position. "The princess had a difficult night," murmured her escort, a tight-lipped woman whose eyes never quite met Alara's. "The physicians are concerned." Alara's stomach twisted. What would happen to her if the princess died? Would she be cast back to the streets? Or worse, blamed somehow for failing at a task she didn't understand? Her palms grew slick with sweat, leaving damp prints on the fine fabric of her dress. The princess's antechamber bustled with activity. Physicians in somber robes conferring in hushed tones, servants scurrying with basins of water and bundles of herbs, ladies-in-waiting dabbing tears from reddened eyes. The air hung heavy with the cloying scent of sickness, barely masked by burning incense and scattered rose petals. King Aldrich stood by a window, his profile sharp against the morning light, hands clasped behind his back in a posture of rigid control. When he turned at Alara's entrance, she was struck by the hollows beneath his eyes, the new lines carved beside his mouth overnight. "Your Majesty," she managed, attempting a curtsy that still felt foreign to her body. "She refuses the physician's remedies," the king stated without preamble. "She will not drink the tonics or submit to the bloodletting. She speaks only of waiting for you." His gaze pierced Alara, searching for something she wasn't sure she possessed. "Whatever connection you forged yesterday, girl, use it. My daughter must be made well." The weight of royal expectation pressed against Alara's chest, making it difficult to breathe. She wasn't a healer. She wasn't anyone. Yet now the king looked at her as though she held some mysterious power, a notion as terrifying as it was absurd. "I will try, Your Majesty," she whispered, the promise settling around her shoulders like a leaden cloak. The royal physicians blocked her path to the princess's bedchamber, their faces masks of skepticism and barely concealed contempt. "This is most irregular," the eldest among them declared, his beard quivering with indignation. "The princess requires proper medical attention, not the company of this." He gestured at Alara as though she were a particularly offensive piece of furniture. "The king commands it," replied her escort, and those 4 words parted the physicians like a blade. Princess Lyra appeared even smaller than yesterday, swallowed by bedding that seemed to consume rather than comfort her. Her skin had taken on a grayish tinge, her breathing shallow and labored. A basin of bloody rags sat nearby, evidence of treatments already attempted. At Alara's entrance, the princess's eyelids fluttered open, and something like relief flickered across her face. "You came back," Lyra whispered, her voice threadbare. "Did you think I wouldn't, Your Highness?" Alara approached the bed cautiously, aware of the critical eyes watching her every move. A ghost of a smile touched the princess's lips. They never do. Not after the first day. The comment sent a chill down Alara's spine. How many others had stood where she now stood? What had happened to them? A severe-looking woman in dark robes stepped forward, holding an ornate silver cup. "Your Highness must take her medicine now," she insisted, her tone leaving no room for refusal. Lyra turned her face away. "It burns. It makes the dreams worse." "It is for your own good, Your Highness," the woman persisted, her knuckles whitening around the cup's stem. Alara observed the standoff, noting the princess's jaw set in stubborn defiance despite her weakness. The way the physician's eyes darted nervously toward the king who watched from the doorway. The tension in the room stretched taut as a bowstring. In that moment, Alara faced her first real decision since being brought to the castle. She could urge the princess to comply, aligning herself with the court and its practices. Or she could... what? Challenge the royal physicians? Contradict the king himself? Either choice could lead to disaster. Her mind raced back to the streets, to the countless remedies hawked by traveling charlatans, to the bitter concoctions that did more harm than good, to the friends she'd watched suffer and die under treatments meant to save them. She thought of the strange closeness she'd felt with the princess yesterday. Two nothings recognizing each other across an impossible divide. Perhaps, Alara said, her voice stronger than she'd intended, Her Highness might take the medicine better if she understood what it contains. The physician's head snapped toward her, eyes narrowing dangerously. The contents of royal remedies are not for common ears. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, but something pushed her forward. Where I come from, people are wary of medicines they don't understand. Sometimes knowing helps. Gee, where you come from, the physician scoffed. People eat garbage and die in gutters. The crude truth of the statement stung, but Alara didn't flinch. Instead, she turned to the princess. In the streets, Your Highness, we have a saying, trust the hand that feeds you, but know what it feeds. A strange light kindled in Lyra's eyes. Interest, perhaps even amusement. What wisdom from the gutters, she murmured. Then, louder, I wish to know what I'm being given. The chamber fell silent. The physician looked to the king, whose expression remained unreadable. Herbs to strengthen the blood. The physician finally relented. Tonics to purge impurities. Essences to balance the humors. That tells me nothing, Lyra countered, a spark of life returning to her voice. Ilara saw her opportunity. Perhaps, Your Highness, you might take some simple food first, to prepare your stomach for the medicine? She glanced around the room, noting a tray of untouched breakfast, bread, honey, dried fruits. In my experience, bitter remedies go down easier after something sweet. The physician bristled. This street girl presumes to give medical advice in the royal chamber? Your Majesty, I must protest. Enough. The king's voice cut through the room like a blade. All eyes turned to him as he stepped forward, studying his daughter's face. Let her try her way. Permission granted, Alara moved to the breakfast tray, selecting a small piece of bread and drizzling it with golden honey. She approached the bed and, after a moment's hesitation, sat carefully on its edge, an intimacy that drew gasps from the ladies-in-waiting. My mother, Ilara said softly, offering the bread to Lyra, before the fever took her, always said that honey carries the strength of 1,000 flowers. The princess accepted the morsel with trembling fingers. And did it save her? The honey? Ilara's throat tightened. No, Your Highness, but it gave her comfort when nothing else could. Lyra took a small bite, then another. Color seemed to seep back into her cheeks, though perhaps it was just a trick of the light. Tell me about her, the princess requested. Your mother. So Alara did. She spoke of her mother's rough hands and gentle voice, of lullabies sung in the darkest nights, of clever tricks for finding food when there was none to be had. She spoke of the woman who had taught her to read scraps of discarded parchment by firelight, who had insisted on dignity even in destitution, who had died holding Alara's hand and extracting a promise that her daughter would live no matter the cost. The words poured out, unplanned and unfiltered. Not the polished tales courtiers might spin, but raw truth, jagged with grief and love. As she spoke, Lyra continued to eat small bites of food, her eyes never leaving Alara's face. The physicians and courtiers watched in stunned silence as though witnessing some incomprehensible ritual. When the bread was gone, Ilara paused, suddenly aware of how much she had revealed, how vulnerable she had made herself before these strangers who held her fate in their hands. The medicine now, I think, Lyra said quietly, holding out her hand for the silver cup. The physician approached warily, as though expecting a trick. The princess drank the contents in one long swallow, grimacing at the bitterness but not complaining. Leave us, she commanded afterward, her voice surprisingly firm. All except her. She nodded toward Alara. No one moved. all eyes shifting to the king. "Your Highness needs rest and supervision," the chief physician protested. "What I need," Lyra replied with unexpected steel, "is someone who speaks to me as a person, not as a collection of humors to be balanced or a vessel to be filled with whatever concoction you deem suitable today." The king studied his daughter's face for a long moment. Something passed between them, a current of understanding that Alara couldn't decipher. Then he nodded once, sharply, and gestured for the room to be cleared. As the door closed behind the last reluctant physician, Alara found herself alone with the princess, the enormity of what had just occurred washing over her in dizzying waves. She had challenged the royal medical practices. She had sat on the royal bed. She had shared intimate details of her life before a court that viewed her as less than human. And somehow, impossibly, she had not been struck down or thrown out. "They'll hate you for this," Lyra observed matter-of-factly, settling back against her pillows. "They already did," Alara replied, surprising herself with her candor. The princess's laugh was soft but genuine, perhaps the first real laugh she'd had in months. "True enough." Her expression sobered. "But now you've made powerful enemies. The physicians believe their concoctions and bloodlettings are the only path to health. You've challenged that belief." Alara's momentary confidence faltered. "I never meant to—" "Of course you did," Lyra interrupted, "and I'm grateful for it." She reached out, her fingers brushing Alara's hand, a touch so light it might have been imagined. "Do you know why my father really brought you here?" Before Alara could respond, a sound from the corridor froze them both. The scrape of metal against stone, followed by a whisper just loud enough to penetrate the heavy door. "You have seen too much." The whispered threat lingered in the air long after its source had retreated down the corridor. Alara's pulse pounded in her temples, her mouth suddenly dry as sand. Princess Lyra's fingers tightened around her wrist, surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "You mustn't walk the corridors alone," the princess whispered, her dark eyes wide with genuine fear. "Not anymore." "Who would—" Alara began, but Lyra silenced her with a slight shake of her head. "Castle walls have ears," the princess murmured, "and the court has many who profit from my condition." The implication sent ice through Alara's veins. She recalled the physician's expensive robes, the way they hovered over the princess like vultures circling prey. How much gold changed hands for each tonic, each bloodletting, each cure that only seemed to weaken Lyra further. A soft knock interrupted them, and Alara instinctively put herself between the door and the princess. A futile gesture, but one that made Lyra's eyes soften with something like gratitude. It was only the young servant girl with the kind eyes, bringing fresh water and linens. She bobbed a curtsy, her gaze darting nervously between them. "Marta," Lyra addressed her, "you'll escort Mistress Alara whenever she leaves these chambers, won't you?" The servant girl's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "Of course, Your Highness." When they were alone again, Lyra sank back against her pillows, the brief show of strength clearly having taxed her limited reserves. "The court already buzzes with talk of you," she said quietly. "The beggar who spoke back to the king's physicians, the gutter rat who sits on royal furniture." Shame heated Alara's cheeks. "I forgot myself, Your Highness. I shouldn't have—" "No," Lyra interrupted. "That's precisely why my father chose you. Because you haven't learned to speak in circles and poison with politeness." A weak smile touched her lips. "It's refreshing." The admission hung between them, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their different worlds. Alara felt herself at a dangerous crossroads. The princess seemed to value her precisely because she was different, yet that difference made her vulnerable to those who ruled the castle's complex hierarchy. "Your Highness," she ventured cautiously, "this morning you said others came before me. What happened to them?" Shadows passed across Lyra's face. They adapted too quickly. "Became courtiers in all but name, telling me what they thought I wished to hear, agreeing with the physicians, disappearing into the castle's machinery." Her fingers plucked restlessly at the embroidered coverlet. "They were rewarded with positions, marriages, lands, and I remained, as you see me." Before Alara could respond, The doors swung open without warning. Several noble ladies swept in, their silks rustling like autumn leaves, perfumes clashing in the confined space. They surrounded the bed, effectively pushing Alara to the margins of the room. "Your Highness, we heard you took medicine today. Such wonderful news. We've brought the most delightful gossip from the southern provinces. Lord Harwick's son has returned from campaign, so handsome now, and asking after your health most particularly." They fluttered around the princess like jewel-toned birds, their words a relentless cascade that allowed no response. Alara watched as Lyra's face settled into a polite mask, all trace of the genuine girl she'd glimpsed now hidden beneath layers of practiced courtesy. From her new position against the wall, Alara observed the subtle dynamics at play. The tallest lady, Lady Beatrice, she gathered from the conversation, dominated the others, her seemingly solicitous questions laced with tiny barbs. Another younger woman watched the princess with naked calculation, her smile never reaching her cold eyes. "And who is this person?" Lady Beatrice finally acknowledged Alara's presence, her gaze sliding dismissively over the borrowed finery. "My new companion," Lyra replied, her tone neutral. "By the king's command." The ladies exchanged loaded glances. "How unusual," Lady Beatrice remarked. "Though one hears the most extraordinary rumors these days. They say she challenged the royal physicians themselves. Imagine such impertinence." "They say she emerged from the gutters," added another, her nose wrinkling delicately, "though someone has clearly attempted to disguise the fact." Heat crawled up Alara's neck, but she kept her face impassive, drawing on years of practice enduring scorn on the streets. There, at least, the contempt had been honest, stones thrown openly rather than wrapped in silk and perfume. "Perhaps she could entertain us with tales of her previous life?" suggested the youngest lady, malice glittering in her eyes. "I've heard the most fascinating things about how those people survive." Alara felt the trap closing around her. Refuse, and she'd be labeled insolent. Comply, and she'd be performing like a trained monkey for their amusement, confirming her status as something less than human in their eyes. The princess's fingers curled into the bed sheets, a subtle tell of distress that only Alara seemed to notice. "I fear my experiences would not amuse noble ladies," Alara replied carefully. "Death and hunger make for poor entertainment." A shocked silence fell over the room. Lady Beatrice's face hardened into stone. "Well," she said finally, "directness at least, if not discretion." "I value truth," Princess Lyra interjected, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "Something in short supply within these walls." The atmosphere chilled perceptibly. The ladies murmured platitudes about the princess needing rest, making graceful retreats while shooting venomous glances at Alara. As the door closed behind them, Lyra exhaled a shaky breath. "Now you've done it," she said, but there was a hint of admiration in her tone. "Lady Beatrice will ensure the entire court knows of your scandalous behavior by supper time." "I spoke out of turn," Alara acknowledged, anxiety gnawing at her stomach. "I've made things worse for you." To her surprise, Lyra shook her head. "No, you've made things interesting." She gestured for Alara to come closer. "Those women have visited daily for months, filling my chambers with empty chatter while watching me fade. Not one has ever acknowledged the reality of my situation." A hint of color had returned to her cheeks. "You made them uncomfortable. It was magnificent." Despite herself, Alara felt a small spark of pride kindle in her chest. She had spent her life being invisible, a shadow that proper folk stepped around or over, never meeting her eyes. To be seen, even in anger, felt strangely empowering. The remainder of the day passed in relative quiet. Alara helped the princess sip broth and read aloud from a book of poetry, her reading halting but earnest. Servants came and went, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. Twice, physicians arrived to check on Lyra, their manner toward Alara notably colder than before. As evening approached, Marta returned to escort Alara to her own chambers for the night. The corridors seemed different in the gathering darkness, longer, more ominous, the shadows between torches stretching like grasping hands. "They're saying things about you," Marta whispered as they walked. "In the servants' quarters." "I imagine they are," Alara replied, keeping her voice steady despite the knot of fear tightening in her chest. Some say you're a witch." Marta's voice dropped even lower. "That you've enchanted the princess and the king." Alara nearly laughed at the absurdity. "And what do you say, Marta?" The servant girl hesitated. "I say the princess ate today, and spoke more than she has in weeks." She glanced nervously over her shoulder. "And I say some people don't like that at all." They turned a corner and nearly collided with a broad-shouldered man in expensive robes. Lord Darius, the king's chief advisor. Alara recognized him from her first day in the throne room. His eyes narrowed as he registered her presence. "The beggar girl," he remarked, his tone making the words an insult. "I understand you've made quite an impression." Alara dropped into a curtsy, Marta doing the same beside her. "My lord." "Tell me," he continued, blocking their path, "what remarkable skills does one acquire in the gutters that qualify one for royal companionship?" The question hung in the air like poison. Alara felt Marta trembling beside her. "None, my lord," she answered honestly. "I have no qualifications. The king's wisdom in selecting me remains a mystery." Lord Darius's mouth tightened. "Indeed, a mystery that has many at court concerned." He leaned closer, his breath hot against her face. "Accidents befall those who rise above their station too quickly. Terrible accidents." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she held his gaze. "I am aware of my place, my lord." "Are you?" His eyes bored into hers. "I wonder." He straightened, adjusting his robes with manicured hands. "The princess's condition has consumed the royal physician's best efforts for months. It would be unfortunate if amateur interference worsened her decline." With that, he swept past them, his shoulder deliberately knocking against Alara's with enough force to make her stumble. Marta clutched Alara's arm once he was out of sight. "Lord Darius never speaks to servants," she whispered, her face pale. "Never." The weight of the encounter settled on Alara's shoulders like a physical burden. In just 2 days, she had drawn the attention of the court's most powerful figures, not as the invisible beggar she had been, but as a threat to be neutralized. Later, alone in her opulent chamber, Alara stood by the window overlooking the castle grounds. Below, nobles strolled through the gardens, their laughter floating up like bubbles in wine. Guards patrolled the walls, torchlight glinting off their armor. And beyond, barely visible in the gathering darkness, lay the town, the world she had known, now as unreachable as the stars. She had never asked for this, never wanted to be thrust into deadly court politics or made responsible for a dying princess. The promised 100 gold coins seemed a cruel joke now, bait in a trap that had snapped shut around her. Yet when she remembered the brief light in Lyra's eyes today, the moment of genuine connection between them, something resolved within her. The princess was drowning in luxury and lies, surrounded by people who profited from her illness. And Alara had spent her entire life fighting to survive. "It doesn't suit you," Princess Lyra observed, watching as Alara tugged uncomfortably at the elaborate gown servants had poured her into. The garment, midnight blue with silver embroidery that caught the light with every movement, weighed on her shoulders like armor, restricting her breathing and pinching at her waist. "Nothing here suits me, Your Highness," Alara replied, attempting to adjust the heavy pendant hanging from her neck. After 5 days in the castle, she still felt like an imposter wearing someone else's skin. Tonight marked her first official court appearance, a banquet to honor visiting dignitaries from neighboring kingdoms. The king himself had ordered her attendance, a command that sent ripples of speculation throughout the castle. Why would a former beggar be presented at a state function? The question hung in the air, unspoken but omnipresent. "Remember to breathe," Lyra advised, her own face pale but composed. After days of small improvements, eating more, walking short distances around her chambers, she had insisted on attending tonight's festivities, overriding the physician's vehement objections. And watch Lady Beatrice's left hand. She gestures with her right when speaking truths, her left when weaving lies. Alara nodded, mentally adding this observation to the growing catalog of court dynamics Lyra had shared. The princess had become her guide to this treacherous new world, pointing out alliances and feuds, explaining the subtle language of fans and handkerchiefs. identifying which nobles could be trusted and which would smile while sliding a knife between ribs. Marta arrived to escort them, her eyes widening at the sight of the princess dressed for court. "Your Highness, you look—" Words failed her. In truth, Lyra still appeared fragile, the rich burgundy of her gown emphasizing her pallor rather than disguising it. But there was determination in the set of her shoulders, a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. The journey to the Great Hall felt interminable. Ilara's borrowed slippers, too tight and slick-soled, made each step treacherous on the stone floors. The princess moved slowly, one hand resting lightly on Ilara's arm for support, though whether she offered stability or drew it remained unclear. As they approached the massive double doors, the sounds of the banquet already in progress spilled out. Laughter, music, the clinking of goblets. Ilara's stomach clenched. On the streets, large gatherings meant danger. Too many hands reaching for too few resources. Too many eyes watching for weakness. "Stand straight," Lyra murmured as the herald prepared to announce them. "You belong here because the king wills it so. No one can challenge that." The doors swung open. The herald's voice boomed. Her Royal Highness, Princess Lyra of House Aldrich, and her companion, Mistress Ilara. The hall fell silent, hundreds of eyes turning toward them. Ilara felt each gaze like a physical touch, some curious, others hostile, a few calculating. She forced herself to breathe, to place one foot before the other, to keep her face impassive despite the terror coursing through her veins. They made their way to the high table where King Aldrich sat with his most honored guests. The king's expression revealed nothing as they approached, though his eyes lingered on his daughter's face, assessing her condition. "Father?" Lyra greeted him with a perfect curtsy, one that Ilara awkwardly mimicked. "Daughter," he replied, rising to take her hand. "Your presence honors us tonight." Something unspoken passed between them, a current of meaning Ilara couldn't decipher. Then the king's gaze shifted to her, penetrating and unreadable. "And Mistress Ilara, I trust you find your position educational." Before she could respond, they were guided to their seats, Lyra near her father, Ilara further down the table, among minor nobles, who shifted subtly away from her, creating an island of emptiness in the crowded hall. The feast itself was an assault on the senses. Servants paraded in bearing platters of roasted meats, exotic fruits, pastries shaped like castles and dragons. Wine flowed freely, the rich burgundy liquid catching the light from hundreds of candles. Musicians played from a gallery above, their melodies almost lost beneath the growing volume of conversation and laughter. Ilara hardly touched her food, her appetite destroyed by anxiety. She observed the court at play, the elaborate dance of flattery and insult, the strategic forging and breaking of alliances over sweetmeats and wine. Lady Beatrice held court at a nearby table, her left hand indeed, gesturing elaborately as she spoke to a circle of rapt listeners, occasionally glancing toward Ilara with thinly veiled contempt. "They say she crawled from the sewers," came a whisper from nearby, just loud enough for Ilara to hear. "That the king found her eating rats in the marketplace." "I heard she bewitched the princess," another voice replied. "Some gutter magic from the eastern slums." "Well, she certainly hasn't bewitched anyone with her manners," a third voice snickered. "Look how she holds her knife, like a butcher rather than a lady." Heat crawled up Ilara's neck, but she kept her eyes fixed on her plate, Lyra's lessons echoing in her mind. Show nothing. Feel everything. Reveal nothing. The court feeds on reactions. A nobleman to her left, young, flushed with wine, and seemingly bolder than the others, leaned toward her. "Tell us, Mistress Ilara, what skills did you cultivate in the streets that so impressed our king? I have certain friends who might value such talents." His meaning was unmistakable, his smile cruel. The table fell silent, waiting for her response. Ilara felt sweat beating along her spine despite the hall's chill. One wrong word could confirm their worst assumptions about her. One display of temper could undo whatever fragile position she'd established. She was saved from responding by a commotion at the high table. Princess Lyra had stood suddenly, her face even paler than before. The king half rose from his seat, concern briefly cracking his regal mask. "I merely need some air, Father," Lyra announced, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "And I require my companion's assistance." Relief flooded through Alara as she rose, grateful for the reprieve. She hurried to the princess's side, offering her arm for support. As they made their slow way toward one of the hall's side doors, she felt the weight of the court's attention following them like a physical presence. Once in the relative privacy of a stone balcony overlooking the castle gardens, Lyra released a shaky breath. "You looked like a rabbit surrounded by wolves," she observed, a hint of amusement threading through her exhaustion. "I felt like one," Alara admitted. "How do you bear it? The constant scrutiny? The viciousness beneath the smiles?" Lyra leaned against the stone balustrade, moonlight silvering her features. "I was born to it. I've never known anything else." She studied Alara's face. "You're doing better than you realize. Your very discomfort unsettles them. They don't know what to make of someone who doesn't play their game." Before Alara could respond, the balcony door opened behind them. Lord Darius stepped out, his imposing figure momentarily silhouetted against the light from the hall. "Your Highness," he bowed to Lyra, "the king requests your return. The ambassador from Westholme wishes to present his respects." Lyra straightened, her royal mask sliding back into place. "Of course, I'll come directly." Lord Darius's gaze shifted to Alara, cold and assessing. "The girl may remain here. This is diplomatic business, not suitable for entertainment." The dismissal stung, but Alara felt a flicker of relief at the thought of a few moments' respite from the court's hostility. "My companion attends me at all times," Lyra countered, her voice taking on an edge Alara had never heard before. "By royal decree." "Or do you question the king's judgment, Lord Darius?" Something dangerous flashed in the man's eyes, quickly masked. "Never, Your Highness. I merely thought to spare her the tedium of diplomatic niceties." "Your concern is noted," Lyra replied, the exchange of pleasantries barely disguising the tension beneath. She took Alara's arm again, and together they followed Lord Darius back into the suffocating warmth of the great hall. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and pointed conversations. Alara stood slightly behind the princess, trying to fade into the background while remaining alert for any signs that Lyra's strength was failing. Twice, she caught Lord Darius watching them with narrowed eyes, his expression calculating. As the night wore on, the wine flowed more freely, inhibitions loosening throughout the hall. A group of young nobles grew increasingly boisterous, their laughter taking on a cruel edge. One of them, a red-faced lord with fingers heavy with rings, pointed openly at Alara. "I say, what does one call a beggar dressed in silk?" he called out, his voice carrying across nearby tables. "A dressed pig is still a pig, is it not?" Laughter rippled outward, faces turning toward Alara with malicious anticipation. She felt the princess stiffen beside her, saw the flash of anger in Lyra's eyes. "Enough," Lyra said, her voice quiet but cutting through the noise like a blade. The hall didn't quite fall silent, but a hush spread outward from where they stood. The young lord's smile faltered. "I was merely jesting, Your Highness," he protested, performing contrition while his eyes remained defiant. "Surely your companion understands the spirit of the evening." Lyra took a step forward, surprising everyone, including Alara, with her steadiness. "The spirit of the evening, Lord Harwick, is diplomacy and dignity, neither of which you currently display." Her gaze swept the watching nobles. "This woman was chosen by the king himself to attend me. Any insult to her is an insult to the crown." The silence that followed was absolute. Alara felt her cheeks burning, torn between gratitude for the princess's defense and horror at being the center of such a scene. Lord Harwick's face darkened with humiliation. He offered a stiff bow. "My apologies, Your Highness. The wine spoke, not I." "See that it doesn't speak again," Lyra replied coldly before turning away, effectively dismissing him, a public reprimand that would not be forgotten. As they moved away, Alara leaned closer to the princess. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered urgently. "You've made him an enemy." "He was already an enemy," Lyra murmured back. "Now he's a revealed enemy, which is far less dangerous." She squeezed Ilara's arm lightly. Besides, you've stood between me and the physician's worst excesses all week. It seemed only fair to return the favor. The simple statement of alliance, the acknowledgement that they were somehow protecting each other, left Ilara momentarily speechless. She had spent her life expecting nothing, receiving less, surviving on scraps of fortune too meager to be called luck. The idea that the princess of the realm would publicly defend her honor was so foreign, it felt like something from a minstrel's tale rather than her own life. As the banquet finally drew to a close, Ilara felt the weight of the night's events settling on her shoulders. She had survived her first court function, but at what cost? How many more enemies had she made simply by existing in spaces where she didn't belong? And how long before those enemies moved from whispers and insults to more dangerous forms of removal? The last thought followed her like a shadow as she helped the exhausted princess back to her chambers. In the flickering torchlight, the castle's beauty transformed into something more sinister, the tapestries depicting hunts and battles now seeming to watch with malevolent eyes, the suits of armor standing guard in the corridors becoming potential hiding places for those who wished them harm. For the first time since her arrival, Ilara truly understood. The castle walls didn't just keep the world out, they kept secrets in. Dawn broke with muted gray light filtering through the leaded glass windows as Ilara slipped from her chambers, careful not to wake Marta, who had fallen asleep in a chair after insisting on standing guard through the night. The castle stirred around her, servants already moving through the corridors with purpose, carrying linens and kindling, speaking in hushed tones that echoed against stone walls. 2 weeks had passed since the banquet. 2 weeks of cautious progress for the princess, whose strength returned in small increments, walking farther each day, eating more substantial meals, spending hours reading aloud or listening to Ilara's halting stories of life beyond the castle walls. The physicians still came with their tonics and instruments, but Lyra now refused the bloodletting and accepted only the mildest of their preparations, diluted with water and taken under Ilara's watchful eye. The improvement should have been cause for celebration. Instead, it had brought a new tension to the castle. Whispers that multiplied like rats in the dark, sidelong glances from courtiers who smiled with their mouths but not their eyes. Even King Aldrich's visits to his daughter had grown more frequent but briefer, his expression unreadable as he observed the changes in the princess. Ilara moved through the servants' passages, routes Marta had shown her to avoid the more populated corridors where nobles might lurk. Her destination was the castle kitchens, a realm she'd discovered 3 days prior when seeking bread and honey for the princess, when her appetite had suddenly returned after a restless night. The kitchens sprawled beneath the great hall, a cavernous space filled with the comforting scent of baking bread and bubbling pots. Heat from massive ovens pushed back the perpetual chill of the castle's stone, creating an environment more reminiscent of the crowded market square than the austere chambers above. "Back again, are ye?" The head cook, a broad-shouldered woman with arms corded like tree roots, looked up from kneading dough as Ilara slipped through the doorway. "The princess hungry this early?" "Not yet," Ilara admitted, her eyes already scanning the shelves laden with jars and bundles. "But she'll need something substantial when she wakes. Yesterday was difficult." The cook grunted, pushing a strand of gray hair back with her flour-dusted wrist. "Difficult, eh? Those physicians still hovering like vultures?" Ilara had discovered an unexpected ally in the cook, a woman who had served 3 generations of royalty and held decided opinions about the current court. Like many of the older servants, she viewed the princess's illness with suspicion, having watched Lyra grow from a robust child to a wilting young woman over the course of months rather than years. "May I?" Ilara gestured toward a small workable in the corner, away from the bustle of preparations for the day's meals. "Help yourself. Just stay clear of Lord Peyton's breakfast tray. The man throws tantrums if his eggs cool." The cook returned to her dough, the rhythmic sound of her kneading creating a comforting backdrop. Ilara moved purposefully, selecting herbs from hanging bundles, chamomile for calming, mint for digestion, a pinch of rosemary for strength. She had begun experimenting with simple teas and broths, drawing on fragmented memories of remedies her mother had prepared in their leaner years. Nothing elaborate or magical, just basic combinations that seemed to settle the princess's stomach when the physician's concoctions left her retching and weaker than before. As she worked, crushing leaves and measuring portions into a small sachet, Ilara's mind turned over the puzzle of Lyra's illness. The pattern had become clearer with each passing day. Improvement in the morning hours, particularly when she ate simple foods that Ilara brought directly from the kitchens. Decline in the evenings, especially after taking the physician's prescribed tonics or eating meals delivered by certain servants. What's this then? A new voice cut through her thoughts, sharp, cultured, dangerously soft. Ilara's head snapped up. Lord Darius stood in the kitchen doorway, looking distinctly out of place among the flour sacks and hanging pots. His expensive robes were impeccable despite the early hour, his ring-laden fingers resting casually on the hilt of an ornamental dagger at his belt. The kitchen fell silent, servants freezing in their tasks. "Herbs for Princess Lyra's morning tea, my lord," Ilara replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. Her fingers instinctively closed around the small bundle she'd been preparing. Lord Darius crossed the space between them with measured steps, each footfall deliberate on the stone floor. "How domestic of you." His eyes flicked over the array of herbs, his nostrils flaring slightly. "And these are approved by the royal physicians, I presume?" The cook had stopped kneading, her flour-covered hands gripping the edge of her table. The other servants had found sudden interest in their tasks, heads bowed, ears straining. "Simple herbs, my lord," Ilara answered carefully. "For digestion and comfort." Comfort. He rolled the word on his tongue as though tasting something suspect. "How interesting that the princess has found such comfort since your arrival." His hand shot out suddenly, fingers closing around her wrist with bruising force. "What exactly did you bring with you from the gutters, girl? What strange Eastern arts do you practice when no one is watching?" Fear slithered down Ilara's spine, cold and paralyzing. The suspicion in his eyes wasn't mere courtly dislike. It was something deeper, more dangerous. "Nothing, my lord," she insisted, pulse fluttering beneath his grip. "Only common herbs. You can ask any—" "I've asked many," he interrupted, leaning closer. "I've asked why a beggar with no apparent skills caught our king's notice. Why the princess improves under your strange ministrations while the kingdom's finest physicians failed for months." His voice dropped to a whisper meant for her ears alone. "I've asked what secrets you whisper to her when the doors are closed." Ilara's throat constricted, her mind racing through possible responses. Denial would look like guilt. Defiance would confirm his suspicions. The weight of the castle's intrigue pressed against her chest, stealing her breath. "The princess is improving because she wants to live, my lord," she finally managed. "Perhaps that's all the mystery there is." Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. Calculation, rage, something else she couldn't name. For a moment she thought he might strike her. Instead, he released her wrist with a small shove that sent her stumbling back against the table. "We shall see." He plucked a piece of bread from a nearby tray, examining it with exaggerated care. It would be a shame if the princess suffered a setback after such promising improvement. Some illnesses are treacherous that way, returning when least expected, more virulent than before. The threat hung in the air, unmistakable. "Begging your pardon, my lord." The cook's voice cut through the tension, her tone deliberately deferential, though her eyes were hard as flint. "But the king himself will be wanting his breakfast tray, and I've servants standing idle while you inspect our humble work." Lord Darius's mouth tightened briefly before smoothing into a practiced smile. "Of course. Far be it from me to delay His Majesty's breakfast." His gaze returned to Ilara, cold as midwinter. "We'll continue our conversation another time." He swept from the kitchens as abruptly as he'd arrived, leaving behind a silence thick enough to slice with a blade. Ilara realized she'd been holding her breath only when her lungs began to burn. Her hands trembled as she gathered the herbs she'd dropped. "That one's trouble," the cook muttered once the sound of footsteps had faded. "Has the king's ear more often than not these days?" "Why would he care about herbs for the princess's tea?" Ilara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The cook's expression darkened. "Some profit from illness more than health, girl." She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving ghostly white handprints. "Mind yourself. and check everything that passes the princess's lips. The warning followed Ilara as she made her way back through the castle, herbs clutched tightly in one hand. Servants moved aside as she passed, their expressions ranging from pity to thinly veiled hostility. Lord Darius's interest had marked her, made her both more visible and more vulnerable within the castle's complex hierarchy. She paused at a narrow window overlooking the inner courtyard, needing a moment to compose herself before returning to the princess. Below, the daily business of the castle unfolded, guards changing shifts, stable hands exercising horses, servants carrying baskets of linens and provisions. And there, crossing the courtyard with purposeful strides, was Lord Darius, deep in conversation with the chief royal physician. Their heads were bent close, their expressions intent. As Ilara watched, the physician nodded several times, his hand moving to a pouch at his belt, a gesture that might have seemed innocent if not for the furtive glance he cast around the courtyard afterward. A cold certainty settled in Ilara's stomach. The strange timing of Lyra's decline, the ineffective treatments that only seemed to weaken her further, the convenient dependency that kept her confined to her chambers, isolated from court politics, her voice effectively silenced in matters of state. It wasn't just negligence or incompetence, it was deliberate. The realization hit Ilara with physical force, nearly doubling her over against the windowsill. She'd suspected something wasn't right, had noticed patterns in the princess's health that corresponded too neatly with certain visitors, certain medications. But the scale of such a betrayal had seemed too enormous to contemplate. Who stood to gain from the princess's extended illness? Who would inherit power if she never recovered her strength? The questions tumbled through Ilara's mind, each more dangerous than the last. She forced herself to breathe, to straighten, to adopt the placid expression she'd perfected over the past weeks. The castle walls had eyes. Lord Darius had made that abundantly clear. She couldn't afford to show what she now suspected. Reaching the princess's chambers, she found Lyra already awake, sitting by the window in a pool of pale morning light. The improvement in her appearance was subtle but undeniable. Her cheeks held more color, her eyes brighter, her posture less hunched against invisible pain. "You went to the kitchens again," Lyra observed, noticing the herbs in Ilara's hand. "Without Marta." "The corridors are safe at this hour," Ilara replied, moving to the small table where she prepared the princess's morning tea. Her hands still trembled slightly, betraying her outward calm. Lyra watched her with that unnerving perception that seemed to cut through pretense. Something happened. It wasn't a question. Ilara hesitated, her back to the princess as she poured hot water into the waiting cup. Should she share her suspicions? The knowledge felt dangerous, a burning coal that could scorch whoever held it. Yet keeping such a secret from Lyra seemed equally treacherous. "Lord Darius found me in the kitchens," she said finally, turning with the steaming cup. "He has concerns about your treatment." Lyra's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Darius has concerns about everything that doesn't bend to his will." She accepted the cup, inhaling the fragrant steam. "What did he say to you?" Ilara chose her words carefully, aware that even in these private chambers, they might not be truly alone. "He suggested that your improvement might be temporary, that your illness could return, more severe than before." Understanding dawned in the princess's eyes. She took a deliberate sip of the tea, her gaze never leaving Ilara's face. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. It was never an illness, was it? The king's private audience chamber felt smaller than Ilara had imagined, an austere space of dark wood and stone, lacking the ostentatious grandeur of the throne room. Morning light filtered through narrow stained glass windows, casting pools of colored light across the worn floor. King Aldrich stood with his back to her, examining a map spread across a heavy oak table, his shoulders tense beneath rich robes. "Your Majesty," Ilara began, her voice wavering despite her efforts to steady it. "I'm grateful for this audience." 3 days had passed since her encounter with Lord Darius in the kitchens, 3 days of mounting dread as she and Lyra pieced together the scattered puzzle of the princess's mysterious affliction. 3 days of watching every shadow, testing every morsel of food, sleeping in fitful bursts with her back to the wall. It had been Lyra who insisted she seek this audience, who pressed the royal seal into her palm and whispered instructions on how to use it. "My father must know," she'd said, her eyes feverishly bright with purpose. "He may be the only one powerful enough to stop this." Now, facing the king's back, Alara's courage threatened to desert her entirely. What had seemed urgent and clear in the safety of the princess's chambers now felt like madness, a beggar accusing the king's most trusted advisors of unthinkable treachery. "My daughter claims you have something of vital importance to tell me," the king said without turning. "Something that could not be entrusted to the usual channels." Alara swallowed hard, her mouth desert dry. "Yes, your majesty." Her fingers twisted in the fabric of her borrowed dress. "It concerns Princess Lyra's condition." "Her improvement, you mean?" Now he turned, fixing her with the same penetrating gaze she remembered from their first encounter in the village square. "Remarkable, by all accounts." "That's what I wish to speak about, your majesty." Alara forced herself to meet his eyes, though every instinct screamed at her to bow her head, to show proper deference. "I believe the princess has been deliberately weakened. Poisoned, not ill." The words hung in the air between them, impossible to recall. Alara's heart hammered so violently, she feared it might burst from her chest. One word from the king, and she would be dragged to the dungeons for such an accusation. King Aldrich's expression remained unreadable. A serious charge. He moved around the table, his steps measured, deliberate. "What evidence supports this theory?" Alara took a deep breath and began to explain. The pattern of decline following specific tonics and meals, the physician's insistence on treatments that only weakened the princess further, Lord Darius's thinly veiled threat in the kitchens, his subsequent meeting with the chief physician. Words tumbled out, gaining momentum as she described her simple remedies and the princess's gradual return to strength once certain influences were carefully removed from her daily routine. Throughout her recitation, the king's face remained impassive, giving no hint of his thoughts. When she finally fell silent, he studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as though hunting for deception. "You understand what you're suggesting?" he said finally. "That members of my court, men who have served the crown for decades, are systematically poisoning the royal heir." Put so bluntly, the accusation sounded fantastical even to Alara's ears. Doubt crept into her mind, cold and insidious. What if she was wrong? What if the patterns she'd observed were merely coincidence, the improvements due to natural recovery rather than her interventions? Who would believe a former beggar over noble-born advisors with impeccable lineages? "I understand how it sounds, your majesty," she acknowledged, her voice smaller now. "But the princess believes it too." "She sent me to you because she fears—" Alara stopped abruptly, suddenly aware of the dangerous territory she was entering. "Fears what?" the king prompted, his tone sharp. Alara hesitated, then committed to the full truth. "She fears you may be unaware of what happens in your own castle, that those closest to you might not have your best interests, or hers, at heart." A muscle twitched in the king's jaw, the first crack in his composure. Bold words from a girl who, until recently, slept in gutters. "Forgive me, your majesty." Alara lowered her gaze at last. "In the streets, one learns quickly to recognize those who mean harm. Survival depends on it. And you believe your street instincts serve you equally well in court politics?" There was something new in his voice, not anger, but a kind of grim curiosity. "No, your majesty. Court politics are far more dangerous." She dared to look up again. "In the streets, enemies declare themselves with knives drawn. Here, they smile while pouring poison." For an instant, something like approval flickered across the king's face, then his expression hardened once more. "If what you suggest is true, then this conspiracy runs deeper than one physician or advisor." He turned back to the map on the table, his fingers tracing invisible paths across territories and borders. "The question becomes, why? What purpose would be served by keeping my daughter weakened but alive?" Alara hadn't expected the king to engage with her accusation so directly. She had prepared herself for dismissal, perhaps even punishment. This thoughtful consideration threw her momentarily off balance. "I believe," she said carefully, that a weak princess creates dependencies. Those who control her control access to her, and through her, to you. Her isolation leaves certain matters of state unchallenged. The king's head jerked up, his eyes narrowing. Specific matters? The Western Treaty, Elara replied, recalling Lyra's whispered concerns during their late-night conversations. The princess opposes the marriage alliance with Westholme. She believes it sacrifices too much for too little protection. Something dangerous flashed across the king's features. Rage, realization, or perhaps both. His hand curled into a fist upon the map, directly over the territory in question. She shared this with you? A serving girl she's known for weeks? She had no one else to tell, Elara answered simply. Everyone else reports to someone. The king's laughter was sudden and harsh, startling in the quiet chamber. And you don't? I report to her, Your Majesty, only to her. Silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. Outside, the castle stirred with morning activity. Distant voices, the clang of practice swords from the training yard, the mournful cry of a hawk circling the towers. If you're lying, the king said at last, or mistaken, the consequences will be severe. I understand, Your Majesty. Do you? He circled the table, coming to stand directly before her. Do you understand that if Lord Darius is indeed behind such a scheme, he commands enough loyalty to make both you and my daughter disappear without a trace? That accusations without absolute proof would only alert him to our suspicions? Our suspicions? The plural sent a ripple of shock through Elara. The king believed her, or at least believed enough to investigate further. What would you have me do, Your Majesty? She asked, her voice steadier now. Continue as you have been. His voice dropped lower, barely above a whisper. Change nothing in your routine. The princess should maintain the appearance of gradual recovery, nothing sudden or miraculous to raise alarm. He paused, studying her face intently. And you will report to me directly, everything you observe, everyone who visits her chambers, every morsel that passes her lips. And the physician's tonics? She must appear to take them. His expression grew grimmer. I'll arrange for samples to be tested, but we need time. Lord Darius must not suspect we're watching him. Elara nodded, the magnitude of her new role settling upon her shoulders like a physical weight. She was no longer merely the princess's companion, but now the king's informant, a precarious position that placed her at the center of a deadly court intrigue. As though reading her thoughts, the king added, Your life depends on absolute discretion. If Lord Darius suspects you've spoken to me, I understand, Your Majesty. And she did, with brutal clarity. She had walked into the castle with nothing to lose. Now she had everything. Good. He turned away, a clear dismissal. Use the servant's passage to return. We must not be seen speaking privately again. Elara curtsied and backed toward the concealed door through which she'd been escorted earlier. As her hand reached for the latch, the king spoke again. 100 gold coins, he said, almost as an afterthought. Do you still want them? The question caught her off guard. The promised payment, once so momentous it had seemed to represent a complete transformation of her fate, now felt insignificant compared to the tangled web of intrigue she'd entered. I want the princess to live, Your Majesty, she answered truthfully. That's worth more than gold. Something indefinable crossed the king's face. Respect, perhaps, or surprise at finding principle in someone he'd plucked from the gutters. He nodded once, sharply, and turned back to his maps. The servant's passage was dimly lit and narrow, winding through the castle's skeleton like a secret vein. Elara moved quickly, her mind racing ahead to the princess's chambers where Lyra would be waiting anxiously for news of the audience. What would she tell her? The full truth would place an impossible burden on the already weakened princess, yet anything less felt like betrayal. She was so absorbed in this dilemma that she nearly collided with a figure emerging from a crossing corridor, a slight man in physician's robes carrying a covered tray. They both startled, the man nearly dropping his burden. Forgive me, Elara apologized automatically, stepping back into the shadows. Her pulse quickened as she recognized him, the youngest of the royal physicians, the one who mixed the princess's evening tonic. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice high with nervousness. "These passages are for authorized servants only. I was sent to fetch fresh linens for Princess Lyra." Ilara lied smoothly, gesturing vaguely behind her. "I must have taken a wrong turn." The physician's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze dropping to her empty hands. "Without a basket?" Ilara silently cursed her carelessness. "I was to collect one from the laundry." "I see." He didn't believe her, that much was clear from his expression. "Well, you're quite turned around. The laundry is in the opposite direction." He shifted the tray to one arm, the covering slipping slightly to reveal a single silver cup. "I'm bringing the princess's morning tonic. Perhaps you should accompany me to avoid further wrong turns." The invitation was a trap, thinly disguised. If she returned with him, she'd be forced to watch Lyra consume whatever concoction the tray contained. If she refused, she'd confirm his suspicions that she'd been somewhere she shouldn't have been. "Thank you," she managed, her mind racing for a way out. "That's most—" A cry from further down the passage interrupted her, a servant calling for assistance with some unseen task. The physician hesitated, clearly torn between investigating Ilara further and continuing his assigned duty. "You'd best find your proper place, girl," he said finally, brushing past her toward the princess's chambers, "before someone notices your absence." Ilara waited until he'd turned the corner before releasing the breath she'd been holding. The encounter left her shaken, not just by the near discovery of her audience with the king, but by the realization of how quickly her newfound knowledge could become a liability. The conspiracy was real, and it had just looked her directly in the eye. The great hall blazed with 100 torches, their flames turning the evening gathering into a sea of flickering light and shadow. Nobles from across the kingdom filled the space, their finest silks and jewels on display for what had been announced as a celebration of Princess Lyra's recovery. 3 weeks had passed since Ilara's secret audience with the king. 3 weeks of careful deception, of the princess pretending to take tonics that were secretly discarded, of Ilara watching every shadow and testing every meal. Tonight marked the culmination of their dangerous charade. The princess would make her first formal appearance since falling ill, demonstrating to the court, and more importantly to her enemies, that she had regained her strength. "Stop fidgeting," Lyra murmured as they waited in the antechamber. "You look more nervous than I feel." Ilara forced her hands to still, though anxiety continued to churn in her stomach. "Forgive me, Your Highness, I can't help but worry." The princess looked striking tonight. Dressed in the royal colors of deep purple and gold, her dark hair arranged in an intricate style, adorned with small crystal flowers that caught the light. The transformation from the frail girl Ilara had first met was remarkable. Though still slender, Lyra now stood straight, her eyes clear and alert, her complexion healthy rather than waxen. "Remember our agreement," Lyra said, adjusting a fold in Ilara's gown, a deep forest green that complemented the princess's attire while clearly marking Ilara as a companion rather than a noble in her own right. "No matter what happens in there, you stay by my side. We face this together." Ilara nodded, touched by the princess's concern for her safety. Over the weeks, their relationship had evolved from the awkwardness of captor and captive into something neither of them had expected, a friendship forged in shared danger, strengthened by mutual protection. The massive doors swung open. A herald's voice rang out, announcing the princess's arrival. Lyra straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and stepped forward into the light, Ilara a half-step behind. The hall fell silent as they entered, hundreds of eyes tracking their progress toward the dais where King Aldrich waited. Ilara kept her gaze carefully lowered, though she remained acutely aware of the tensions rippling through the crowd. Surprise at the princess's obvious recovery. Calculation as alliances and plans shifted in response. Undercurrents of anger from those whose schemes were now threatened. Lord Darius stood at the king's right hand, his face a mask of pleasant surprise that did not reach his eyes. Beside him, the chief physician watched Lyra's approach with thinly disguised disbelief, his fingers tightening around his goblet until his knuckles showed white. The princess ascended the steps to the dais with measured grace, performing a perfect curtsy before her father. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice clear and carrying to the farthest corners of the hall. "I am pleased to join the court once more." King Aldrich rose from his throne, his expression giving nothing away. "Daughter," he acknowledged her, "your recovery brings joy to the kingdom." He gestured to a smaller throne beside his own. "Take your rightful place." The symbolism was unmistakable. For months that throne had remained conspicuously empty during court functions, a visible reminder of the princess's absence from matters of state. Now, by inviting her to sit publicly at his side, the king was making a declaration that required no words. The princess had returned to power. Lord Darius's smile tightened imperceptibly. "A miraculous recovery, Your Highness," he observed as Lyra seated herself. "The physicians must be commended for their extraordinary efforts." "Indeed," Lyra replied evenly, "though I find I owe my health to simpler remedies in the end." Her gaze shifted briefly to Alara, standing quietly at the foot of the dais. "Sometimes the most effective medicines are the least complicated." A muscle twitched in Lord Darius's jaw, the only sign that the barb had landed. The chief physician began to speak, but was interrupted by the king. "Tonight we celebrate," King Aldrich announced, rising again to address the court. "But first, a matter of royal business that cannot wait." He gestured, and guards moved to close the hall's main doors with an ominous finality. "A grave matter has come to my attention, one that strikes at the heart of the crown itself." A ripple of unease passed through the assembled nobles. Ilara felt her pulse quicken, her palms growing damp with cold sweat. This was not part of the plan she and Lyra had discussed. The celebration was to be merely that, a public demonstration of the princess's recovery, not whatever the king now intended. "For months," King Aldrich continued, his voice hardening, "my daughter suffered from a mysterious ailment that defied treatment. Court physicians administered tonics and remedies, yet she grew weaker rather than stronger." His gaze swept the hall, settling momentarily on Lord Darius. "I have discovered the reason for this failure." The hall had gone deathly silent. Even the torches seemed to still their flickering, as though the very air held its breath. "Poison," the king stated flatly. "Administered regularly, carefully, designed not to kill, but to weaken, to remove my daughter from court affairs while maintaining the appearance of natural illness." Gasps and murmurs erupted throughout the hall. The chief physician had gone pale, his eyes darting toward the sealed doors. Lord Darius remained composed, though Ilara noticed his hand had drifted to rest near his ornamental dagger. "A serious accusation, Your Majesty," Lord Darius observed, his voice smooth as oil. "One that would require substantial evidence before action could be taken against whoever might be responsible." "Evidence has been gathered," the king replied coldly. "Samples of the princess's tonics have been tested. Servants have been questioned. Correspondence has been examined." He nodded to a guard, who stepped forward bearing a small wooden chest, including this, recovered from a hiding place known only to members of the royal council. The guard opened the chest, revealing vials of viscous liquid and several sealed parchments. Lord Darius's composure finally cracked, a flicker of genuine alarm crossing his features before he mastered it. "Your Majesty," he began, "in matters of state security, certain precautions." Silence. The king's command cut through the hall like a blade. "You have been my trusted advisor for 20 years, Darius. You stood beside me when my wife died. You helped raise my daughter." His voice grew quieter, more dangerous. "And you slowly poisoned her because she opposed your plans for the Western Treaty." Lord Darius's hand moved in a blur, drawing his dagger even as he lunged toward the princess. "She knows nothing of statecraft," he snarled, his mask of civility falling away entirely. "The alliance with Westholm is our only protection against the eastern hordes." Guards surged forward, but they were too far, too slow. Ilara moved without thinking, throwing herself between the blade and the princess. She felt a sharp, burning pain as the dagger found her shoulder instead of Lyra's heart. The hall erupted in chaos, nobles scrambling toward the exits, guards rushing the dais, the chief physician attempting to flee only to be tackled by castle guards who had clearly been waiting for just this moment. Ilara sank to her knees, warm blood soaking through the fine fabric of her gown. The pain was strange, distant, yet all-consuming, like fire viewed through frosted glass. She was vaguely aware of Lyra kneeling beside her, pressing something against the wound, her face tight with fear and grief. "Stay with me," the princess ordered, her voice shaking. "Don't you dare leave me now." Ilara tried to smile, though her lips felt strangely numb. "I'm not going anywhere, Your Highness." Around them, the situation was being brought under control. Lord Darius had been subdued, his dagger skittering across the marble floor, his face contorted with fury as guards dragged him away from the dais. The chief physician was already in chains, his protests falling on deaf ears as evidence of his complicity was read aloud by the king's justice. King Aldrich himself knelt beside Ilara, his royal dignity set aside in the face of her sacrifice. "Bring my personal physician," he commanded. "Not one of the court charlatans, Master Edwin from the Eastern Tower." His hand briefly touched Ilara's uninjured shoulder. "You will not die for this loyalty, girl. I forbid it." Ilara wanted to laugh at the idea that even a king could forbid death, but the sound emerged as a pained gasp instead. "The 100 gold coins," she managed, her thoughts growing fuzzy at the edges. "I think I've earned them now." Something like grief passed across the king's face, an emotion she would never have expected to see directed at someone like her. "You've earned far more than gold," he said quietly. The next hours passed in a blur of pain and voices. Ilara drifted in and out of awareness as she was carried to a chamber she'd never seen before, larger and more luxurious than her companion's quarters. Hands cleaned and bandaged her wound. Voices murmured about fortune and half an inch to the left, and guardian angel. Through it all, Lyra remained at her side, refusing to leave even when courtiers came seeking audience in the aftermath of the dramatic revelations. When Ilara finally regained full consciousness, dawn light was filtering through unfamiliar windows. She lay in a bed softer than any she'd known, her injured shoulder thickly bandaged but no longer burning with the intensity of before. Lyra sat in a chair beside the bed, her court finery exchanged for a simple robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. "You're awake," the princess observed, relief evident in her voice. "Master Edwin said you would be, but I feared—" She trailed off, unable or unwilling to give voice to her darkest concerns. "What happened?" Ilara asked, her throat dry and voice raspy. After you nearly died saving my life," Lyra supplied, reaching for a cup of water and helping Ilara take a careful sip. "Lord Darius has been imprisoned, along with 5 others implicated in the conspiracy. The chief physician confessed to everything once he realized the evidence against him." Her face darkened. "They've been poisoning me for nearly a year, small doses, carefully timed to create dependency without risking death." Ilara's mind struggled to process the enormity of it all. And now everything changes. Lyra set the cup aside, her expression solemn yet touched with something like hope. "My father addressed the court after you were taken away. He named me his formal heir, something he'd delayed doing while I was ill. And he—" She hesitated, as though uncertain how to continue. "He what?" Ilara prompted, trying to push herself up and wincing as pain lanced through her shoulder. "He named you my official advisor," Lyra said quietly. "Not companion, not servant, advisor, with all the rights and privileges the position entails." Ilara stared at her, certain she'd misheard or misunderstood. "That's impossible. I'm nobody. I have no education, no family name, no—" "You have courage," Lyra interrupted, "and loyalty, and wisdom born of hardship rather than books." She reached out, taking Ilara's uninjured hand in both of hers. "You saved my life twice over, first from the poison, then from the blade. There are noble-born advisors who would have hesitated to do either." Ilara shook her head, overwhelmed. From beggar to royal advisor in less than 2 months. It was the kind of transformation found in minstrels' tales, not in the harsh reality she'd always known. "There will be resistance," Lyra acknowledged, reading her expression. "Many at court will see you as an upstart, an interloper. They'll work against you, undermine you, test your resolve at every turn. Just like they did with you," Ilara observed quietly. A smile touched the princess's lips, not the polite mask she wore for the court, but a genuine expression of warmth. "Just so, which is why we'll face them together." She squeezed Ilara's hand gently. "The beggar and the princess, An unlikely alliance, perhaps, but one forged in fire. Outside the window, the castle was coming to life. Servants calling to one another across the courtyard, horses being led from the stables, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. The familiar sounds of a world continuing to turn, oblivious to how profoundly Alara's place within it had changed. "What about the 100 gold coins?" she asked finally, a smile tugging at her own lips despite the pain. "Does a royal advisor still receive payment for services rendered?" Lyra's laughter filled the chamber, bright, genuine, healing. "I think, my friend, that you've earned far more than gold." She gestured toward the window and the kingdom beyond. "You've earned a voice in shaping what comes next." And in that moment, Alara understood the true value of what she'd gained. Not wealth or title or power, but the chance to matter, to be seen, to help build something better than what had come before. From the cold streets where survival was the only goal, she had found her way to a place where she could make a difference. The beggar had become an advisor, but more importantly, she had become a friend. Sometimes the most profound transformations begin with a single moment of courage. A beggar girl willing to speak truth in a world built on beautiful lies. Alara's journey reminds us that our worth isn't determined by our circumstances, but by the choices we make when facing impossible odds. When she stood between a blade and a princess, she wasn't thinking about gold or titles. She acted from the most authentic part of herself. What would you risk for someone who saw your true value when the rest of the world looked right through you? Would you have the courage to challenge powerful figures who profit from others' suffering? In a world where appearances often matter more than truth, perhaps we all need to ask ourselves, what silent poisons might we be accepting simply because they come in beautiful vessels from trusted hands? If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to support our channel with a like and share. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these powerful tales of courage, transformation, and unexpected friendship to life. Until our next story, remember that sometimes the most unlikely alliances create the most powerful changes, and that true nobility has nothing to do with birth and everything to do with character.